Professor Waziyatawin is a Dakota writer, teacher and activist from the southwest of Minnesota. She earned her PhD in American history from Cornell University and currently holds the Indigenous Peoples Research Chair in the Indigenous Governance Program at the University of Victoria. Her work seeks to build a culture of resistance within Indigenous communities to recover Indigenous ways of being and to eradicate colonial institutions. Sorry, I got that wrong. I want to do that again. So just relax. I must be nervous after my lunch. Jeez, I'm going to do that again. Here we go. I'll get it right this time. Her work seeks to build a culture of resistance within Indigenous communities to recover Indigenous ways of being and to eradicate colonial institutions. She is the author or co-editor of 6 volumes, including What Does Justice Look Like?, The Struggle for Liberation in Dakota, Homeland, and edited with Michael Yellowbird for Indigenous Minds Only, a Decolonization Handbook. Nō reire te iwi homai ko te pakipaki, Professor Te Omorangi Waziyatawin from Dakota. Tēnā koe.
Iho, hamitakiapi, awas inchantewa stayana be chiusabiye. A damakota, Dakota ia Waziyatawin, demie, a pejihu de zizik abi makoche hechia tahawahie. Hello, my relatives. It's with a good heart that I greet all of you with a handshake. I am Dakota, and in Dakota they call me Waziyatawin, which translates as woman of the north. And I come from the place where they dig for yellow medicine. And in English, that place is known as the Upper Sioux Reservation, and it's located in the southwestern part of Minnesota. And before I begin my presentation today, I just want to make a couple of comments. First of all, I just want to express what an honor it is to be in Aotearoa. This has been a dream of mine for at least 15 years. I think I've wanted to come here. I've wanted to be able to learn about the immersion schools, the language revitalization movement, and I'm so thrilled that I finally arrived. And I want to thank everyone for graciously welcoming me into your homeland. I also want to take this opportunity to give thanks to the organizers of this conference. I have to say that I think that this is the best organized conference that I've ever been at, and I can't believe the attention to small detail, the consideration for all of the guests, the visitors, the beauty of everything they've put together. So I just want to say, Nina Wopida Chichiapi, I give you many thanks to all of the conference organizers. I also want to say that it's been such a pleasure to experience the legendary hospitality of the Maori people. I've eaten so well since I've been here and had a chance to try a lot of new foods, and I thank you. You represent the best, I think, of indigeneity. Finally, I just want to make a comment about how humbling this experience is. When I've had the opportunity to hear what I would consider to be the most excellent orators, oral historians, and speakers since I've been here, and I can only hope that I can help contribute to the conversation a little bit. The title of my presentation is Indigenous Survival and Resurgence in an Age of Crisis. But before I get to the survival and resurgence part of it, we have to spend some time flailing in the muck. We have to take honest stock of what's happening to our beloved Mother Earth. We have to contemplate the experiences of not just our indigenous human relatives, but all of our non-human relatives as well. 200 species will go extinct today. During the course of the conference, 600 species that once populated our Earth Mother will die as the last of their kind because their habitats are choked with toxins or simply are no more, because their food sources have also disappeared, or because the climate is changing so fast that they're unable to adapt in time to save themselves. As many as 70,000 species will go extinct this year, ranging from the smallest microbes to the largest mammals. We have a planet that is out of whack, and all life is in danger. So let me ask, do you know how many species can go extinct in your ecosystem before the entire ecosystem collapses? Is it 10? Is it 100? 1,000? 100,000? Part of the problem is that nobody knows. Scientists used to think that there would be a gradual degradation of ecosystems at a relatively steady pace until an ecosystem collapsed. But now they realize that there's not a steady decline. Instead, as an ecosystem weathers various assaults, there is an omega point or a tipping point, and once that point is breached, the collapse happens immediately. And no one knows precisely when or where that tipping point might be for any given system. We could wake up one day and find that the ecosystem that we live in no longer supports life. Coral reefs are being destroyed more rapidly than rainforests, and every second, 1.5 acres of rainforest is gone. In the Arctic, glaciers the size of Manhattan are melting into the sea. Kuna people off the coast of Panama are already losing their island homes from rising sea levels, while Inuit in the Arctic are losing their means of subsistence from loss of sea ice and the melting of permafrost. The elders among the indigenous peoples of Ecuador are saying they no longer know when to plant because rain no longer comes when expected. Sami people of Finland, Norway, and Sweden are facing a crisis with reindeer, their primary food source, because lichen, the reindeer's vital food source, is disappearing with increasingly mild winters. In fact, indigenous populations all over the world are experiencing an increase in diseases with rising temperatures, worsening drought and desertification of lands, often with accompanying dust storms and wildfires, as well as flooding, erosion of coasts and riverbanks, longer living and invasive insects that can destroy native plants and animals, stronger and more severe weather patterns and disasters, and changes to the seasonal patterns of birds, animals, plants, and flowers. All of these things are a consequence of the rapacious appetite of industrial civilization. For indigenous people around the globe, this appetite was fed and continues to be fed through the colonial machine. Now, in the 21st century, we all face what some experts are calling the perfect storm of ecological and social problems. Climate chaos and ecological destruction are compounded by population growth and the depletion of resources such as fossil fuels, water, and topsoil. And although indigenous peoples were not the ones to create these crises, our populations are often the first ones to recognize the dangerous threats to our homelands and to experience the detrimental effects of the ways of the colonizers. Sometimes it's difficult for us to recognize the destruction to our homelands. Sometimes the destruction occurs slowly over time, and we don't recognize it. Sometimes, if we don't live close to the land on a daily basis, we can miss the signs. Sometimes, we can only see the external beauty of the lands and waters, and it's easy to miss how they've been harmed. The picture you see here is of my homeland in the Minnesota River that runs through our community. And there are days when it looks so beautiful, it's very easy to forget that it's filled with toxins, that we can't eat the fish, we can't swim in the water. And even when we are aware of what's happening in our homelands, we may not be aware of what is happening in other people's homelands, or we may not consider the ways in which we contribute to or are complicit in the destruction of someone else's indigenous homeland. Whose homelands are destroyed for the rare earth minerals in our cell phones and computers? Whose waters are toxified so that we can have access to abundant fossil fuels? How many plants and animals have been sacrificed to support the lifestyles from which many of us continue to benefit, in spite of our status as colonized populations? I ask these questions and make these points not from a position of self-righteousness, because I'm here rolling in the muck as well. But I'm making these comments from a place of critical self-reflection. If nothing else, my research into climate chaos has fostered a desire to unravel the ways that colonization continues to bind our minds. And most of us here, including myself, are now also caught up in a lifestyle that has us contributing to the destruction. Furthermore, many of us have embraced notions of progress. We've embraced a belief in the permanency of empire and nation states. And we've embraced an assumption about the inevitability of technological advancement and growth. Buying into the myths of settler society is a consequence of colonization, but it's colonization with a twist. That twist is its combination with the relentless exploitation of fossil fuels that has allowed industrial civilization to temporarily flourish. Because of the success we've witnessed in terms of technology, especially, many of us no longer can envision anything else. Many of us can no longer imagine a future without the fossil fuel-based technologies upon which we've become dependent. For most of our ancestors, however, it was just the opposite. One of the famous leaders among our Western relatives, the Hunkpapa Lakota leader Tatanka Iotanka, or Sitting Bull, perceived white people forcing us into their culture in ways as an injustice. He said, "White men like to dig in the ground for their food. My people prefer to hunt buffalo as their fathers did. White men like to stay in one place. My people want to move their teepees here and there to different hunting grounds. The life of white men is slavery. They are prisoners in towns or farms. The life my people want is freedom. I've seen nothing that a white man has, houses or railways or clothing or food, that is as good as the right to move in the open country and live in our own fashion." But not so today. Few Indigenous people talk of relinquishing the comforts and luxuries of the modern world, even when the way of life of industrial civilization is harming the earth. I rarely hear critiques of industrial civilization or our participation in it, nor do I hear a call to abandon the material aspects of colonizing culture. Somehow, we've come to believe that we can have it all. We can have a fossil fuel-based life and values based on kinship with all of creation. that we can buy into the paradigm of unlimited economic growth, and we can lament the commodification of our homelands, that we can maintain industrial civilization, and we can live close to the land. Evo Morales said, "We have a stark choice between capitalism and survival. Either capitalism lives or Mother Earth lives." And the same could be said about industrial civilization. Either industrial civilization lives or Mother Earth lives. We cannot have it all. That is our inconvenient truth. And as Indigenous peoples, it's essential that we do not forget to measure the costs to our kin. Prior to colonization and industrial civilization, Indigenous ways of life allowed our ancestors to live on the same land base over thousands of years without destroying it. For most of us in this room, how long do you think we could continue to participate in this modern, high-tech lifestyle without destroying not just our homeland, but the entire planet, especially if we're doing it with 7 billion other people? Does anyone think that this way of life can exist for thousands of years on the same land base? By all indications, this way of life will not exist another century, and the longer it lasts, the more dire the consequences to the rest of creation. James Hansen, the NASA scientist who brought global warming to the attention of the world when he testified before the US Congress in the 1980s, wrote in 2009, "The urgency of the situation crystallized only in the past few years. We now have clear evidence of the crisis. The startling conclusion is that continued exploitation of all fossil fuels on Earth threatens not only the millions of species on the planet, but also the survival of humanity itself. And the timetable is shorter than we thought." Even if we continue along the current trajectory, as long as the fossil fuels hold out, our survival is still in jeopardy. Access to cheap fossil fuels has afforded the unsustainable burgeoning of the population of the planet. It's caused unprecedented human-caused CO2 emissions and the likelihood of increasing political violence. Disruptive climate change will lead to extreme weather events, humanitarian crises, and violence over the remaining resources. We have what Christian Parenti has labeled a catastrophic convergence, which means not only that several disasters in political, economic, and environmental areas happen simultaneously, but also that these problems compound and amplify one another. Marion King Hubbard, who coined the term peak oil, plotted oil production on a 10,000-year chart, demonstrating that industrial civilization's use of oil is what he called a unique event in human history, a unique event in biological history. It is non-repetitive, a blip in the span of time. And I like the chart on the screen because it shows, if you take the broad view of history, that the point where we're at now is quite extraordinary. It will not be repeated, and it will end. Of course, CO2 emissions are directly linked to the fossil fuel age, as is the exponential growth in human population. And as Michael Rupert has pointed out, there's a 96% correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and economic growth. So you have four things connected here. You have fossil fuel exploitation, you have CO2 emissions increasing, you have the growth in human population, and you have economic growth. And all four of those things are tied together. So you start messing with that equation, and they will all be affected. Much of what we attribute to the modern world is dependent on this temporary state of fossil fuel exploitation, and that era is ending. But the effects may be permanent, or else, at the very least, last for centuries. The New Zealand Climate Change Centre, in explaining the scientific basis behind the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC, in 1992, agreed that in order to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, we must stabilize atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. The question is, at what point are greenhouse gas concentrations dangerous? In a 2010 meeting in Cancun, Mexico, countries who had ratified the UNFCCC agreed that global warming could not rise above 2 degrees Celsius. Scientific assessments have shown that if we are to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius, we need a globally coordinated program to reduce our net GHG emissions to near zero during the 21st century, to near zero, and we aren't even close. In fact, the number is rising. So what does dangerous anthropogenic interference mean? Of course, this is a reference to man-made or human-caused problems, but what is a dangerous level? How do you figure out when it becomes dangerous, especially when we know our populations are already feeling the effects? In Aotearoa, you are likely to see an increase in temperature of over 1 degree Celsius by 2050 and over 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and that's compared with 1990 levels. There are likely to be fewer frost days in winter and more hot days in summer. One of the greatest impacts of climate change is likely to be on water resources, with higher rainfall in the west and less in the north and the east. Climate change is expected to cause more frequent extreme weather events such as droughts and floods. And like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org, who I understand was just on or has been on tour here, agrees with the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. He built his organization around the number 350, which some leading scientists say is the safe upper limit for carbon dioxide measured in parts per million in our atmosphere. And now, of course, just recently in 2013, we are already over 400 parts per million right now. He also believes that this is what we need to control the rise in temperature and to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius increase. And he recently pointed out in his article, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math in Rolling Stone magazine, some startling figures. He said that there are 565 gigatons of known, that's the amount of CO2 that we can put in the atmosphere to keep from raising 2 degrees Celsius, and that there are 2,795 gigatons of known carbon reserves in the ground that are worth an estimated $27 trillion. And that's 5 times more than what is perceived as the safe upper limit. So the scary thing about that is that if all of those reserves were taken out of the ground, if they were exploited, that we are 5 times over going to be surpassing that safe, or what is perceived as the safe upper limit. As one climate writer has noted, there's enough oil in the ground to deep fry the lot of us. But not everyone even agrees that a 2 degrees Celsius represents a safe upper limit, or that achieving that today is even possible. There's a Canadian analyst named Corey Morningstar who has taken exception with McKibben's approach with 350.org. She says, the 350.org statement above is incredibly dangerous and misleading as it implies 2 things. Number 1, that we can continue to burn more fossil fuels for some time, and number 2, that only when we exceed 2 degrees Celsius do we risk catastrophe for life on Earth. And it fails to mention a third, the fact that we are already committed to a minimum temperature increase of 2.4 degrees Celsius, according to some experts, even if we stop burning all fossil fuels today. So where are we at right now? Well, we're already close to a 1 degree increase over pre-industrial levels of CO2, and we're already experiencing dangerous climate change. Since the 1970s, the world's biodiversity has declined by 30%, while humans continue to outstrip the resources by 50%. We have increased drought and fires, desertification or dust bolification, bleaching coral reefs, sea level rising, Arctic ice and permafrost melting, and worsening water crises. In 2012, one of the world's leading experts on the Arctic predicted that we could see the final collapse of summer sea ice in the Arctic within 4 years. And a recent report just estimated that climate change now causes 400,000 human deaths each year, in addition to the 70,000 species that I've already mentioned. Over 30 million people were displaced by climate-related extreme weather events in 2012, and it's increasingly likely that millions more will be displaced in the coming years. So if that's where we're at now, a 2 degrees Celsius increase looks even more frightening. At 2 degrees Celsius, we're likely to go past many of the Earth's tipping points. That means probably the large-scale disintegration of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, and perhaps all the ice sheets on the planet. It could mean an eventual sea level rise of 70 meters, extinction of 15 to 40% of plant and animal species, ocean acidification at dangerous levels, significant tundra loss, increasing methane release, widespread drought, and desertification. As climate research has noted, within this century, Maori will face increased water stress as droughts increase and there's more demand for water in hot, dry summers. And I think farmers here have already seen this past year as they faced an extraordinary dry spell in rural communities in the North Island. Higher temperatures and lower rainfall are expected to reduce soil moisture as well as groundwater supplies. New plant and animal pests are likely to emerge, facilitating the spread of pathogens and diseases. With increasing human population, there will also be increasing habitat loss. Coastal populations will face sea level rise, surging storms, high tides, and more frequent coastal inundation, as well as erosion of coastal infrastructure, such as roads, homes, and services. Food gathering places and sacred sites may also be jeopardized. In light of this, even with the 2 degrees Celsius maximum, wouldn't you consider this dangerous? The liberal wing of the green movement largely fails to address the core issues driving climate change, in that it will not fundamentally challenge the exploiting systems and institutions. Rather than focusing on taking whatever action is necessary to stop CO2 emissions, most of the conversations in government, corporate, and even nonprofit organizations are only willing to advocate solutions that will allow industrial civilization to continue and that support continued economic growth. On a finite planet, this is suicide. Continuing her critique of 350.org, Cory Morningstar wrote, "One must take note of 350.org's obsession with fossil fuels exclusively. With certainty, 350.org, in tandem with the nonprofit industrial complex, is strategically preparing the populace to accept what Guy McPherson calls the third industrial revolution. This climate wealth agenda will include false solutions, such as biomass, unbridled green consumerism, carbon market mechanisms, etc. What it will not include is the urgent necessity to destroy the expanding military empire, to transition from, dismantle our current economic system, to address the industrialized livestock industry, to massively scale back and conserve, to employ tactics of self-defense by any means necessary, nor anything else that is imperative to address if we are to mitigate full-out omnicide. In a nutshell, the agenda will not include anything that would actually pose any meaningful threat to the system." And in the 21st century, we face a multitude of other crises as well. Barlow and Clark and Blue Gold write, 31 countries in the world are currently facing water stress and scarcity. Over 1 billion people have no access to clean drinking water, and almost 3 billion have no access to sanitation services. By the year 2025, the world will contain 2.6 billion more people than it holds today, but as many as 2/3 of those people will be living in conditions of serious water shortage, and 1/3 will be living with absolute water scarcity. Demand for water will exceed availability by 56%. In March 2013, The Times in Shanghai reported that 28,000 rivers had disappeared from China's state maps, which officials blamed on climate change, which they say caused waterways to vanish. Environmentalists have attributed the loss to ill-conceived development plans and severe overexploitation, and chances are it's a combination of both. Climate blogger Joseph Rahm has written that drought is the most pressing problem caused by climate change. It receives too little attention. He points out that he realized the term desertification may not be an accurate one, or that he was perhaps using it in the wrong way to describe the effects of drought combined with the deluge precipitation that just runs off because of the ground is too hard to absorb the water, and the loss of snowmelt in higher elevations. Many deserts are biologically diverse, and what we see happening in the United States is not a diverse landscape being created in this process. So now he uses the term dust bolification to describe the process that will have a devastating impact, especially on issues of food security. Historically, humans adapted to dust bolification with abandonment. And Rahm says the very word desert comes from the Latin desertum, for an abandoned place. What lands of the future will become uninhabitable because of lack of water and fertile lands? And what does this mean for indigenous populations when we are connected to a specific land base? Drought, along with flooding and wildfires, are increasingly problems throughout the world. In July 2012, lack of rain was the leading cause of grid collapse in India. And you might wonder, how are the two connected? Well, the farmers there, especially in northern India, rely on the monsoon rains to irrigate their crops. And less rain means that farmers need to pump more water from deep boreholes that is subsidized by electricity. And at the same time, less monsoon rain also causes water levels to drop and hydropower production to slow. Last year, in my homeland of Minnesota, Makoche, there was an article in the Minneapolis Star-Trib that talked about water shortages in our homeland. And to me, that was an absolutely shocking story. Our ancient name as Dakota people for our homeland is Minnesota Makoche, which translates as land where the waters reflect the skies. And our ancestors named our homeland that because it has 15,000 lakes and about 6,000 rivers and streams. And so imagine, in about 150 years, colonizing society, industrial civilization have turned this land of abundant water into a land where there's water shortage. So what is the solution? Vandana Shiva in Soil, Not Oil outlines 2 steps that we must take in this context if human beings and the planet are to survive. She says we need to power down energy and resource consumption, creating a fossil fuel-free future. And we need to power up creative, productive human energy and collective democratic energy to make the necessary transition that brings people back into the sustenance economy and that will help both people and the land. This is a perfectly logical solution to the current crises. If rising CO2 emissions are the problem, the reasonable answer is a fossil fuel-free future. But this is not the solution that people in power want to hear, let alone follow, and Shiva knows this. She further points out that the eco-imperialist response to the climate crisis is to grab the remaining resources of the planet, close the remaining spaces of freedom, and use the worst form of militarized violence to exterminate people's rights and people themselves when they get in the way of an insatiable economy's resource appropriation driven by the insatiable greed of corporations. Indigenous scholar Daniel Wildcat refers to this as a culture of self-termination, by which he means we are killing ourselves by ending the lives of many of our other than human relatives on which our own lives depend. It's suicide. Okay, so despite this terribly bleak portrayal, I still have a sense of hope. We've spent time in the muck, and now I think we can talk a little bit about survival and resurgence. While the future of climate chaos is frightening, if there are any populations in the world with the capacity to survive, it will be indigenous peoples. The destructive force of more than 5 centuries of colonization is waning, finally, if only because the colonizers are running out of resources to exploit. Empires fall, especially in the face of shortages of resources, and always because they are inherently unsustainable over the long term. This vulnerability in the armor of empire will provide unprecedented opportunities for reclamation and rebirth. Our gift as indigenous societies that have lasted thousands of years is that we have the capacity to act in the interests of the long term and the broad view. Okay. Within our grasp is the dream of decolonization. And when I speak of decolonization today, I want to speak about the elements of resistance and resurgence. In the race for the last grab of the world's remaining resources, we'll need to ramp up our resistance in defense of our homelands. And we will need to effectively work to ensure that the costs of industrial civilization are not exported to indigenous homelands elsewhere. In other words, we need to divest ourselves from our involvement in and complicity with an exploitative society, and we need to defend our lands like our lives depended upon it, because they do. At every step, we need to ensure that the cost of destroying our homelands will be too high for governments and corporations to pay. If we want our future generations to be born into a life that can still be sustained by our Mother Earth, we must fight now. Decades ago, Vine Deloria Jr. wrote in God is Red, "The future of humankind lies waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up their responsibilities to all living things. Who will listen to the trees, the animals, and birds, the voices of the places of the land?" In the past, it was our ancestors who were committed to listening to our non-human relatives because they worked diligently to maintain respectful relations with creation and because they believed in the ethic of balance. And I think we still maintain the values of our ancestors, but few of us practice a sustainable way of life that allows us to live those values. It seems to me that Deloria's call and the wisdom of indigenous teachings around the world support a vision of decolonization that includes both resistance and resurgence. If we listen to the cries of our animal and plant relatives, if we feel the anguish of the spirit of toxic waters, they will prompt us to act. Today we have the opportunity to fulfill that role again, and the lives of our future generations may depend on our capacity to pick up that mantle. We need to be better listeners. But us attempting to return to a way of life respectful of creation will not stop global warming. It will not stop the corporate exploitation of our homelands, and that's why we need resistance as well. Lastly, decolonization, as resurgence, is a mechanism for us to live our values and worldview in a more meaningful way. More than any time in our history, today it is absolutely clear that everything that we were taught about the superiority of the colonizers' way was a lie. We know it's a lie because it's proven itself unsustainable, so dramatically unsustainable that within a few short centuries, the colonizers are destroying the life that we all need to survive. For centuries, our cultures were diminished by colonizing society because we did not hold the same beliefs regarding the exploitation of the environment, about a hierarchy of creation, about progress. As Indigenous people, do we aspire to join, uphold, and participate in the culture of the colonizers that's destroying the world? Or do we choose to fight for, and to recreate ways of being consistent with our teachings and values? In the context of global crises, what will you do? Padamia, thank you.